Linux runs the internet. It runs most of the world's servers. It runs Android phones. It powers supercomputers. It even runs parts of Wall Street. So here's the strange part. Why does almost nobody use Linux on their personal computer? Or at least, why does it feel like nobody does? If Linux is so powerful, so flexible, and so widely used behind the scenes, why is Windows still on most laptops? Why is macOS the default for so many creators? Why don't regular people walk into a store and ask for a Linux machine? This question sounds simple, but the answer is more complicated than most people think. First, we need to understand something important. Most people don't choose their operating system. It's chosen for them. When someone buys a new laptop at a big retail store, it usually comes with Windows already installed. If they buy a Mac, it comes with macOS. Very few machines on store shelves come with Linux pre-installed, and that matters more than people realize. Because most users don't install operating systems, they don't compare distributions. They don't research kernels or desktop environments. Turn on their computer and use whatever is there. Linux isn't losing because it's bad. It's just not the default. Now let's talk about awareness. Ask the average person what Linux is, and many won't know. Some might think it's a programming language. Others may assume it's something for hackers. Linux has a branding problem. Microsoft and Apple spend billions on marketing, commercials, product launches, influencers, huge announcements. Linux doesn't have a single company behind it pushing it to the mainstream. Linux is open source. It's community-driven. It grows quietly, and in today's world, quiet software doesn't usually win attention. But there's another reason. Comfort. People don't switch operating systems easily. Once someone has used Windows for 10 or 15 years, it becomes second nature. They know where things are. They know how to fix basic issues. Work, school, and habits are built around it. Switching feels risky. Even if Linux is faster, even if it's more private, even if its free risk is powerful, then there's software compatibility. Certain industries depend on specific tools, Adobe apps, specialized business software, corporate systems tied to Microsoft products. Even though Linux alternatives exist for many things, not every tool works the same way. For a developer or tech enthusiast, finding workarounds is normal. For the average person, it's frustrating. And that frustration can be enough to push someone back to what's familiar. There's also the reputation problem. For years, Linux had a reputation for being hard, complicated, terminal-based, only for programmers. That reputation isn't fully accurate anymore. Modern Linux distributions are extremely user-friendly. You can install apps with a click. You can update the system easily. You don't need to touch the terminal if you don't want to, but reputations stick. Many people still think Linux means typing commands into a black screen. And here's the interesting twist. Even if people don't use Linux directly, they're already using it indirectly. Android, Linux-based. Most websites running on Linux servers, smart TVs, routers, embedded devices. Many use Linux. Linux isn't absent from people's lives. It's invisible. And sometimes being invisible is both a strength and a weakness. Because Linux doesn't need mainstream dominance to succeed. It's already succeeding where it matters most. In infrastructure, in servers, in development, in stability. But that doesn't answer the personal computer question fully. And that's where this conversation gets more interesting. Because the real reason nobody uses Linux might not be what you think. And that's what we'll break down next. Let's go deeper. Another big reason Linux isn't widely used on personal computers comes down to simplicity, but not in the way you might think. Windows and macOS offer one official version,
Ow.
one main experience. Yes, there are updates and additions, but the brand is unified. When someone says I use Windows, everyone understands what that means. With Linux, it's different. There isn't just one Linux. There are many distributions: Ubuntu, Linux, Mint, Fedora, Debian, Arch, and dozens more. For beginners, that variety feels overwhelming. Instead of clarity, they see choices. And too many choices can freeze people. Most everyday users don't want to research which distro fits their workflow. They just want a computer that turns on and works. Linux gives freedom, but freedom requires decisions. Decisions create friction. Now let's talk about support. When something breaks on Windows, people assume they can call support, walk into a store, or ask a friend who probably also uses Windows. It feels backed by a giant company. Linux support is different. It's community-driven. Forums, documentation, Reddit threads, YouTube tutorials. The help is often excellent, sometimes better than corporate support, but it requires initiative. For tech-curious users, that's empowering. For casual users, that's intimidating. Another factor is schools and workplaces. Most schools teach students on Windows or Chromebooks. Most offices run Microsoft tools. People get trained on these systems from a young age, so by the time they buy their own laptop, they stick with what they already know. Operating systems are habits built over years, and habits are hard to break. There's also the business side of things. Microsoft works directly with hardware manufacturers. You buy a laptop, Windows is already installed. The partnership keeps Windows in front of consumers automatically. Linux doesn't have that same massive commercial push. Some companies sell Linux laptops, but they're not on every store shelf. They're not heavily advertised during holiday sales. They don't dominate retail space. So again, it's not that Linux is losing because it's worse. It's losing because it's less visible in the consumer space. Now here's something interesting. When people actually try Linux, many are surprised. Modern Linux distributions are clean, fast, stable, easy to install. Software can be installed with a few clicks. Updates are smooth. Any common tasks, browsing, streaming, writing, emailing, work perfectly. But most people never reach that discovery phase. They assume it's complicated and stop there. And assumptions are powerful barriers. Let's also be honest about one more thing. Gaming used to be a major weakness for Linux. Years ago, if you were a serious gamer, Linux wasn't realistic. That reputation stuck. Today, gaming on Linux is much better. Thanks to tools like Proton and platforms like Steam, many Windows games run surprisingly well, but the old perception still lingers. Reputation moves slower than reality, and that applies to Linux in many areas. So when people ask, why does nobody use Linux? The real answer isn't that nobody does. Millions of people do. It's just not the default for everyday consumer machines. And the reasons aren't about capability. They're about familiarity, marketing, visibility, and habit. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the most important one. Because in some ways, Linux doesn't actually need mass adoption to win. And that's what we'll talk about next. Now here's the twist. Linux doesn't actually need everyone to use it. That might sound strange at first, but think about it. Linux already dominates where it matters most. It runs the majority of web servers. It powers cloud infrastructure. It's trusted in security-heavy environments. Developers rely on it. Tech companies build on it. In many ways, Linux already won the infrastructure battle. It's the only place it doesn't dominate is the average home desktop. And maybe that's okay, because Linux was never built primarily as a mass consumer product. It wasn't created by a marketing team. It wasn't designed around retail partnerships. It grew from collaboration, community, and technical problem solving. That DNA still shapes how it evolves today. And that brings us to another important point. Linux appeals to a different mindset. Most people want something that works with minimal thought. They don't care how the operating system works underneath. Just want it to open their apps, save their files, and not get in the way. Linux can absolutely do that today. But it also offers something more. Control. Control over updates. Now, control over privacy. Control over customization. Control over what runs on your machine. And not everyone values that control equally. Some people are comfortable with cloud accounts, background services, and tightly controlled ecosystems. Others start to question those trade-offs. And that's where Linux becomes interesting. As more people become aware of data tracking, subscription fatigue, and system restrictions, Linux starts to look less extreme and more reasonable. 10 years ago, choosing Linux felt radical. Today it feels practical for certain users. Another reason Linux isn't mainstream is psychological. People assume switching operating systems is a massive leap. It feels like moving to another country, new language, new rules, new habits. In reality, modern Linux desktops are not that dramatic. The basics are familiar. Taskbars, file managers, browsers, settings menus. Yes, there are differences, but they're not impossible to learn. The biggest barrier isn't technical, it's mental. Most people don't switch because they never have to. Windows works well enough, Macs work well enough, so there's no urgent reason to change. Without urgency, people stick with the familiar. But here's something to consider. If Linux were truly unusable, it wouldn't power the backbone of the internet. It wouldn't run mission-critical systems. It wouldn't be trusted in environments where stability matters most. The idea that nobody uses Linux is misleading. Millions do. They just don't always advertise it. Linux users aren't as visible in mainstream consumer culture. There aren't flashy ads or celebrity endorsements. Linux spreads differently. It spreads through curiosity, through recommendation, through people who try it and realize it fits their needs. So maybe the better question isn't, why does nobody use Linux? Maybe the better question is, why don't more people try it? Because once people actually try it, even for a week, many realize it's not what they expected. It's not just a hacker tool. It's not just for programmers. It's not stuck in the past. It's modern, fast, private, flexible. And whether Linux ever becomes the most popular desktop operating system isn't really the point. The point is that it exists as a real alternative. And in a world where choice is shrinking in many areas of technology, having a real alternative matters. So the next time someone says, nobody uses Linux, remember this: the world runs on it. And maybe the only reason more people don't use it personally is because they haven't looked closely enough yet.